Hey guys, so last lesson then we were looking at the liberal view of the existing order. So the existing order where liberalism was born from or born in antithesis to was feudalism. And in feudalism you had no social mobility, you were essentially born in what we'd call now a social class and you would die in that class too. There was a rationality, so essentially the laws of the countries were sort of dictated to by the church. It was illegal, for example, to question the theory of the four humours. So the theory of the four humours believed that if you were unwell, it was due to an imbalance of one of the four humours in your body. So if you had lots of hot flushes, there was probably just too much blood in you, so you'd just stick a leech on your arm to get rid of some of it and things like that. And anybody who questioned science, and which is essentially the foundations of science, is about questioning, it's about inquiry. Anybody who questioned the foundations of scientific theory in that time was considered a heretic and burned at the stake. So not exactly the ideal society for trying to get over disease and so forth. So essentially is a society which was irrational, so not based on facts, you're not allowed to question things and so forth, and there is no individual freedom at all. So liberals criticised this, they questioned this and wanted to move away from it. So what was their vision of a future society? So they had issues with the previous society. What would they like to see in their ideal society? So the liberal vision for a future society. Essentially, it lies in the connection between these images here. So you've got a church, you've got this idea of knowledge and education, and the light bulb, which represents enlightenment. So the one that's the odd one out is the church. So the liberal vision of a future society is a society that is grounded in reason, in facts, in experimentation, in questioning, and not in this idea of this higher power having untold control over human beings. So it's about questioning the power of the church, and it's about moving towards a more fact-based society. And this really kicked off in the Enlightenment period. So the Middle Ages are sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages, although important to bear in mind that it was only a dark age in Europe, and the rest of the world wasn't as irrational and underdeveloped. But essentially the Enlightenment represents almost the turning on the light of these European countries, a moment where people in Europe start to question. You have the birth of European philosophy in the 17th century, and things like you had Vesalius, who actually worked out the way that the body worked through dissection and so forth. So it's the beginnings of a more accurate science in Europe, and it's also the beginnings of rumblings for things like democracy. You start to have revolutions in the 18th century advocating liberal ideas like free choice and so forth. And the reason why this rationalism is grounded in liberalism is because it's this idea that human beings are rational. We are intelligent creatures. We don't need to have some higher authority constantly telling us what to do. In fact, that stifles our growth. We need to be trusted as individuals to make the right decisions and left alone in order to do that, because we are guided by reason. We are an intelligent species. So the individual then is central. So Charlie Chaplin had an interesting quote. He said, "I am what I am, an individual, unique and different, with a lineal history of an ancestral promptings and urgings, a history of dreams, desires, and special experiences, of all of which I am the sum total." So in terms of being an individual, it's about you being you. You're not part of a group. You're not represented by the group that you're in. You are literally just yourself. And it's about putting that individualism at the centre of the ideology and the supremacy of the individual as the most important thing and most important component of society. Although I think it's important to really dissect this idea, and if we were in class we would, but how far are we actually individuals? So being an individual, does that mean to stand out in a crowd? And if that's the case, maybe you wear outfits which people don't wear that often around you, but there'll be someone else not even a mile away from where you are, probably wearing the same edgy jeans that you're wearing and so forth. So can you even be an individual in a liberal society? Because everything's mass produced. Somebody's wearing the same outfit as you. Somebody's using the same technology, probably even making the same jokes because we're all watching the same TV shows. But nonetheless, in terms of liberalism, the individual is supreme. The individual is really important. So the primacy of the individual then. So as Immanuel Kant said, he said, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. So essentially, we are individuals and we are the centre of humanity. And it's about respecting each other. I mean, a more famous philosopher said, do unto others as you would do unto yourself. Do unto yourself as you would do unto others. So it's kind of just, he's paraphrasing Jesus a little bit there. But essentially, individuals need to be at the centre of the decisions that we make. And those the choices that we make should be about respecting the individual, never taking advantage and never exploiting them. And if you're thinking about feudalism, that entire system was built around the exploitation of individuals. It's all about exploiting their labour, it's about taking away from them and just using them as what he says means. An individual becomes something that you use rather than somebody that you respect. So individualism as a key term then means belief in the supreme importance of the individual over any social group or collective body. Now that also means that this is quite contrary to socialism. So socialism, it's about society. It's about whatever decision you make needs to be about what's best for everybody in society. Whereas liberalism says it's not about what's best for everybody. It's about what's best for individuals. So if you have a choice. You can fight to close the pay gap in an office for women, and you can go to the manager and say, I want to close the pay gap. It's unfair that women are getting treated unfairly. It's unfair that women are being paid less than men. Okay, so you can go and do that. But if you get into that office to represent all the women in your office, and you say to your manager, I want to close this pay gap, and he probably will say to you, do you know what? I can't afford to give everyone more money, but because you've shown excellent leadership, I'm going to give you a pay rise. According to liberalism, the individual, you, should say, okay, that's great, thank you, and put your own interests above the collective. So that's kind of the nature of this idea of individualism in liberalism. So the argument then is that society is atomistic. So what that means is, just like you can see in this image, you have yourself and then you have other people and you just bounce off of each other. So like atoms just bounce away from each other. They're in the same space, but they'll bounce off of each other. It's the same thing with society. So we are egotistical. So in terms of human nature to liberals, yes, we are rational, which means we can make the right decisions. And we're actually, because we're rational, we're the best people to make decisions for ourselves. But we're egotistical. We're obsessed with our ego. We're obsessed with ourselves. And any decisions we make are going to be based on what's best for us. So don't be making any deals with anybody about, say, for example, fighting for your equal pay, because ultimately they'll drop you as soon as they get the chance. They're always going to make the decision which is going to further their interests the most, because we are egotistical and also self-sufficient. So the state needs to leave us alone too, because we're the best people to make decisions, and we don't need some arbitrary government telling us that we need to go to school. Because we're rational. We can decide whether or not that's good for us. Most of us will make that rational decision to go to school, but it's not right for us to force people to be there against their will. So atomism then is a belief that society is made up of a collection of self-interested and self-sufficient individuals or atoms rather than social groups. So as Margaret Thatcher said, who was actually a conservative but stole a lot of liberal ideas, as Margaret Thatcher said, there is no such thing as society. we're just individuals living in the same space, and we're going to care for ourselves more than we're going to care for other people, because it's the rational thing to do. So John Stuart Mill is actually, interestingly, one of my favourite philosophers. I think he's a very interesting person. I probably don't agree with a lot of what he says, but I find him a fascinating man. And he essentially argues, he, liberal thinker, argues that the individual can only flourish when left alone. And this is a quote from his book on liberty. He says, "The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it." So according to Mill, his idea of freedom, and he goes on to say, if I was to walk around the room swinging my fists, my freedom only ends when your nose begins. So I can keep swinging them until I'm going to come into contact with someone else. So to him, he's talking about this idea of negative freedom. So people should just be left alone to do what they want. If a person perceives their own good as taking heroin, that's fine. They're rational. They know that the dangers of doing that. You should leave them to do it. Don't impede them in their efforts to obtain their own idea of good. So leave them alone. And government's only role should be to stop somebody taking away your freedom, to stop somebody punching you in the nose. That's the only role of government. It should be as limited as possible. So government's only role, according to John Stuart Mill, is to stop us from hurting each other. Other than that, let us flourish. And we can only flourish when we're left alone. So if freedom is the power to choose, how much choice should an individual be allowed? So John Stuart Mill addresses this question by talking about two things. He talks about self-regarding actions. So for example, shooting up heroin, that's something that only affects me. You can argue otherwise, but it's something that only affects me. Other regarding actions is if I suddenly started putting needles in your arm and giving you heroin, that would be other regarding. So that needs to be stopped. I'm not allowed to do that. I can only hurt myself. I'm not allowed to hurt anybody else or make choices that hurt anybody else, for example. So to him, it's about maximum choice in regards to the self and self-regarding actions. Although you can argue, if I did become a heroin addict, that's going to negatively impact on my family, probably negatively impact on my students as well, and so forth. If I was a mother and I was doing heroin, that's going to have a negative impact on my child. I have a needle phobia though, so I am definitely never ever doing heroin. So, in summary then, the liberal view on the vision of future society is about guaranteeing equality in the sense that the individual can grow as much as they wish. There is no accident of birth. So in feudalism, you had the accident of birth, that your position in society happened on wherever you happen to be born to, which is a complete accident, isn't it? So removing this accident of birth and saying, if you work hard, you can get to the top. It's about replacing the irrational with the rational, so with reason and enlightenment, and supporting the idea that science is greater than religion. It's about developing scientific discoveries, and it's about letting people have the freedom to develop those discoveries too.